Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. And I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK in Kosovo. Today I will be discussing some key international questions with a major security analyst, and our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Jim O'Brien, Vice Chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group in charge of European operations and former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Carving Up Europe. Moscow's strategy towards Europe is reminiscent of carving a hunted game. At least 4 portions of the continent are targeted by the Kremlin: Anglo-Saxon, West European, Central European, and Orthodox Balkan, with the remainder of Europe's east to be directly devoured by Russia. A primary focus of subversion is to drive a permanent wedge between continental European and the Anglo-Saxon countries, the US, the UK, and Canada. The former are viewed in Moscow as more corruptible and exploitable, while the latter challenge Russia's revisionism. Kremlin propaganda depicts the US as a hegemon that limits the sovereignty of European states and pushes them into conflicts along Russia's borders. In this schema, the UK is an American puppet that has been untethered from the continent following Brexit. The second carving strategy is to expand fissures between West Europeans and Central Europeans. Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are depicted as nationalistic and Russophobic and prevent rapprochement between Brussels and Moscow. A third Kremlin carving maneuver encourages a neutral bloc across Central Europe consisting of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia. Having failed to keep these countries outside the alliance, Putin officials calculate that politicians can be bought or blackmailed, transforming Central Europe into a zone increasingly alienated from Washington. Moscow also endeavors to pull Slovenia and Croatia away from Western institutions through energy contracts and opaque investment, thus completing a long wedge of influence between Ukraine and the Adriatic that could disable NATO operations in the event of war. A fourth carving opportunity is in the Balkans, where the goal is to create an orthodox bloc and shield the region from American influence. Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria are earmarked as the core of this portion of Europe. Greek governments have a long tradition of pro-Moscow sentiments. Bulgaria is perpetually prone to Russian influence through numerous political and economic entanglements, and Serbia values Russia as a counterpoint to EU and US pressure in rejecting Kosovo's independence. Moscow is fixated on keeping Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, and Kosovo outside of NATO, so it can deepen its political, economic, and informational inroads. The last portion of the European carcass are former Soviet republics that Moscow either intends to absorb into its economic and security structures or transform into neutral satrapies. These include Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. With Europe preoccupied with internal divisions and unsettled relations with the US, the Kremlin calculates that it can achieve most objectives without resorting to significant military action. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, Jim O'Brien. Welcome to the show, Jim. Jim is Vice Chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group here in Washington, in charge of European operations. And just to refresh our memories, for those of you that haven't been around for the past 20 years, Jim has served 2 US administrations as Special Presidential Envoy, including overseeing policy towards the Balkans, and was Senior Advisor to US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Again, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me, Janusz. Hot seat. I'm now feeling a little nervous, but let's go ahead.
Well, in case it gets wintry, it keeps you warm. Well, let us begin with some of your recent activities, your recent positions as presidential envoy. Can you give us a little bit of a background before you return to the Albright Group, what you've been doing in recent times?
So toward the end of the Obama administration, the president ordered a review of how the administration, the government, was supporting Americans who'd been taken hostage abroad. There were these horrific murders by ISIS of U.S. journalists. And the president felt that the government hadn't been well coordinated and hadn't done everything possible to get people home. So the administration, led by the president, by Lisa Monaco, his advisor on counterterror issues, decided to do a few things. One is they created an all-of-government task force where all the information the U.S. government had came together in one place. And that's important as a model for some of the other issues we'll discuss in this show. And then they created a position of an envoy. And so my job was the one to negotiate with the people holding Americans, but also to speak up for the individuals whenever there was a policy discussion related to a place where Americans were being held. It was grueling and fascinating. I feel good that we got more than 100 people home. We addressed a lot of the hard, long-term cases, but I feel horrible that I walked out the door with a dozen people still being held, and those are the ones I think about every day.
Has that position been, your position has been replaced by anybody?
No.
Somebody following up? No.
No. In the reorganization, Secretary Tillerson said he intended to keep the position within state, and I know at the White House there's some interest, but I think they're having difficulty finding a person to take it on.
Yeah. And now back at the Albright Stonebridge Group, what is it you do there exactly?
We work with companies and NGOs, political organizations around the world. All our work is really outside the United States. We call it commercial diplomacy. And essentially it's helping companies deal with a JV partner or a joint venture partner or maybe a government where they've got some sort of a problem.
Including the Balkans?
We don't do much in the Balkans. It's we have done a few things over the years, but it's very limited for us. We work, we're a couple hundred people, we work around the globe. For the Balkans, it's sort of so close to our government service that we felt like we've only done things when we were very close to the people who were actually running the business, and so it's pretty rare. Maybe twice in 15 years.
Right. Yeah, still very fondly remembered in Kosovo in particular.
I have a lot of fond memories and good friends there. Yeah.
Jim, let's start then about our new administration, not so new now, 10 months. How would you assess the first 10 months of the Donald Trump administration in terms of foreign and security policy? Was it below expectations, above expectations, or about what you expected?
I don't know how to describe my expectations. I'd say this was an administration they did not expect to win. They were not prepared to govern, and they've appointed people who have no experience of governing. Now, I served in a Republican administration, several Democratic administrations, and it does take a bit of time. I'm encouraged that Wes Mitchell, with whom you've worked, has just taken over as the Assistant Secretary for Europe. So they're slowly getting people with experience in key positions. What's not clear is whether the administration is committed to running a serious foreign policy with sustained attention to areas like the Balkans. I think that's something they will have to make clear in the months to come for a bunch of reasons I'm sure we'll get into.
Right. Well, in particular, what is your view of the national security team? What seemed to begin as a struggle between the more isolationist protectionists around Trump, some of his advisors, and the more traditional Atlanticists, the latter seem to have won. I mean, would you agree? The national security team looks pretty strong.
I think it is. I think there's a set of issues with this team, and some of this goes to the challenges that I think the emerging democracies in the Balkans face as well. So on the broad orientation of the national security team, I agree. It's a very traditional, standard foreign policy. The talk of a Europe whole and free, from the Adriatic to the Black Sea to the Baltic, to the Atlantic. All of that is classic post-Cold War American policy. It is a stark departure from the kind of casual criticism that the president uttered during his campaign. There are 2 points of difficulty. One of them is how engaged the administration will be in the tactical retail politics of making that vision real. So just a few things. I'd say Ukraine, a place I've been spending a fair bit of time and attention. This is a pivotal moment for reform in Ukraine. Vice President Biden spoke with President Poroshenko virtually every week. He was deeply engaged. He also spoke with the leaders of Cyprus regularly as they were working through their peace process. I see no indication that anyone in the administration is that deeply involved in these issues. That allows for a lot of drift. And especially when you have a hostile power to the east or north, kind of manipulating events on its side, it really does reduce American involvement. There's still a lot of American influence. I think of, our old friend Hoyt Yi became very involved in the constitutional crisis in Macedonia. His visit in early May was pivotal in resolving that. That's the kind of thing. Well, that's right, and also and I think that's the kind of excellent diplomacy that the State Department can do if it is empowered to carry it out, and if it's backed by the Vice President, the National Security Team, and the Secretary's office. So I hope to see more of that and more involvement from the political leaders.
Wouldn't you say Vice President Pence has been more active? I mean, having visited Montenegro and the Adriatic Charter Summit and so forth.
So he's been handed the sort of Central and East European account, and I think this leads to the big question about the administration. In addition to will he get as involved as senior figures have before, it's a question of how much the president will allow him to carry out his role. And my concern as an American, just as a citizen, is that I see a hollowing out of our presidency. He relies on his family and a few people very close to him. If you're a foreign leader, those are the people you want to influence. You don't engage with the institutions of our government. You don't have to trust what the institutions of our government do. And I think until the administration clarifies that someone like Vice President Pence actually speaks for the president, or Secretary Tillerson, who's going through his own issues with whether he speaks for the president, until they clarify that, it will always be a little bit difficult to deal with the question of just how strongly America engages. Which brings me to one point I'd encourage everyone listening to this as they try to interpret American politics. Right. I see a lot of leaders in the Balkans say they have some special in to this administration. We hear that in every administration. The leaders are smart. They know they don't have it. And I wouldn't believe it when someone announces Trump has agreed to go to Belgrade, or he's just given an interview in which he criticizes 20 years of U.S. policy.
I remember the euphoria in Banja Luka during the
This is manipulation by political leaders who are trying to claim something. It's made a little easier for them because there clearly is some disconnection between the West Wing of the White House and the rest of the administration. But it's not real. And so I'd encourage in people's domestic political calculations, they realize anyone who's telling them that they have a special in is probably doing it for domestic reasons. Sure. It's not real.
And to add to what you were saying, at times it seems the president undercuts the policy of his national security team. We saw this over North Korea with Secretary Tillerson.
Yeah.
And if that's replicated elsewhere, that's potentially very, let's say, disconnecting in terms of U.S. policy.
It is. And so the way they try to explain this is that he's playing not even bad cop, he's playing crazy cop. And the problem is that's a very short-term approach, right? He at some stage has to endorse the diplomatic initiative that is underway. And, he hasn't done that yet. And I just think it's he seems to have a need to always look like he's winning. And so he's claiming victory when he doesn't have it, and claiming that these outrageous positions are merely a way of getting a little more, even though they don't do that. And it's not. It's very sad.
Related to that, we kept hearing this idea, this slogan, America First. Is there a strategy behind it, or is it simply a political slogan?
Just a political slogan. One of the ways that it is... So my view of U.S. politics is that we're at a really interesting time. Since we were much younger men, so since the mid-'70s, basically, the U.S. has run under one paradigm, the Ronald Reagan paradigm, which is small government and small-town values. a sort of nostalgic view. It's 40 years old. It's just old. These paradigms, they just fall apart at that point. And so you see on the Republican side that all the politicians who ran as the next Reagan produced no enthusiasm in the 2016 race. On the Democratic side, you see this enthusiasm now for some big government solutions and other things. I don't know how that's going to shake out. Now, one of the ways that America First comes forward is that it's clear we have to make more investments within the United States. We have to educate our people better. We have to help people who feel trapped. I'm from the middle of the U.S. I'm from a town that's been buffeted by free trade, massive immigration. I mean, it's sort of all the brew that has produced Trump. And I see a lot of Americans are just tired. And so they would like to see more investment there. And there are plans for a lot more investment in the United States. I think it's a false choice to say that that comes at the expense of being active in the world. In fact, as I think you and I would agree, being more active in the world creates the conditions. You know, even my home state of Nebraska, I think it's almost 50%. It's more than a third of the corporate earnings there come from exports, come from engagement with the world. And so, even in that environment, when I talked, I've spent a lot of time there over the last months. When I talk to people, they all say, yeah, we probably need to be, deeply engaged with Mexico. We need to be engaged in the world, although they're happy to see someone talk about their needs first. So it's really not a strategy, it's more a slogan, and it doesn't predict a radical change in our engagement with the world. I think there were people in the White House who wanted that, but they're gone.
I was going to say, do they still have some influence? These alt-right, Breitbart, economic nationalists, whatever they can call themselves?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to how should a government be run? And it seems clear the president likes to talk to some coterie of people who've been around him, and they never quite go away. So they will have influence. But,
Well, one issue, of course, that Trump did raise during the campaign was NATO, which he at one point described as obsolete.
Yeah.
Evidently, it's no longer obsolete. When he met with the Secretary General, he admitted, we've now underscored the importance of Article 5, America's commitment. Visits of Vice President Pence and others to Europe have, I think, reinforced that. How do you see the future of NATO evolving under this administration?
Yeah, I think it's... at the moment, I'm optimistic. I see it continuing to improve. I think, so the president didn't admit that it was not obsolete. He claimed credit for making it not obsolete, which is his own psychosis. But I think there's a renewed acknowledgement across the administration, or across the alliance, that we do have a problem with Russia. That So 7 years ago, I advised on, I was out of government, but advised on NATO's new strategic concept, and it remains the concept NATO has today.
The 96 one, right?
No, this is a 2010.
2010 one.
And the most striking thing for me in that process was how much we engaged a lot with Russians in that process. We went around and met with all the allies. We spoke with everyone about their needs. It was striking that the Russians acknowledged they had defined themselves in opposition to the West. This was even before Putin's emergence as a protector of Orthodox Christianity and Russian nationalism. Right? He really did that when he returned to the presidency, and so even at that point, it was apparent that NATO had to develop a strategy that would approach the issues Russia was presenting. Some of that is classic defense. So like the forward deployments, the engagement, I think President Obama said by 2013 or 14, he said, I want there to be Americans in the Baltics. I want when if Russian troops ever cross the border, I want them to know they're pretty likely to meet an American, not just an Estonian. And I think that kind of commitment is at the heart of the alliance. It takes the two things, though. It takes the administration, the U.S. administration, to make sure that, we'll say, the most far western NATO allies are also fully committed to the defense of the East, and that they're not just sort of saying that's their problem on that side and we'll just work on our issues here. And I think we haven't seen that level of engagement yet. I think the second issue is the diversity of the threat Russia poses. It's classic security, maybe modified to include cyber attacks and other things. But it's also the disinformation campaigns, the very cheap ways that we've seen Russia intervene. I mean, this illiberal campaign against NGOs and civic activists, I think, is inspired, encouraged. You know, I would just urge citizens in Macedonia and elsewhere to ask, you know, who's funding the Knights of Malta or these other anti-Soros groups? It's not an upsurge of citizen grassroots. It's coming from somewhere else, and you know, you ask who's paying for it, and that's who benefits.
We saw this with environmental groups suddenly sprung up in Romania during the shale gas
yeah, it's a great analogy, and I think that it's that sort of multifaceted you know, opposition. Russia's just against what we're for, and that's sad. It's a missed opportunity for Russia, but I think for the states in Central Europe and especially the Balkans, this is really important. For your issues aren't just local; they are also geopolitical, and be aware of that.
As you've brought Russia to the forefront now, could you sort of give us a little bit of background? I think it's important for our viewers to see how Russia perceived or wanted to perceive Trump during the election campaign and once he won the campaign, and how that has changed over the past few months, what they expected from him.
Yeah, well, okay, that's way beyond my... what did they expect? I assume there are several different views of Trump in Russia. But what does seem to be apparent is in Russia's engagement with Western democracies, or, and we saw this in Ukraine, we've seen it elsewhere. There are two threads to their engagement with these democracies. One of them is to try to find compliant or friendly leaders. And I think some in Moscow may have seen President Trump in that light. He had spent a long time raising money in Russia, looking for deals in Russia and other things. Whatever the facts of his business are, we don't know, right? He hasn't made that public. But the second issue is a Russian interest in just kind of chaos and emphasizing the divides that are very real in every society. And so I think they saw Trump as a kind of agent of this, because he was preying upon some of the very real divides in America, you know, things that we do have to address, and he's also playing on some of the worst instincts in America. You know, for America, racism is our great stain. It's a thing that motivates a large part of our population, and it's something we have to find a way to address. And I think from a Russian standpoint, if they have a loud political voice who encourages, you know, white supremacists, that's a victory. The fact that he won office, well, you know, maybe even more. The risk for them at the moment is I think they've seriously overplayed their hands. You know, I know from my standpoint outside government, and even as I went back in, it was very difficult to, until early 2014, it was very difficult to persuade people that we should be paying attention to all Russia's activities in the region. And you don't have difficulty persuading people of that any longer. So I think they may regret the backing against
them in a way, this interference in our election.
I think what it's done is create an American policy-oriented class that understands that Russia has to be dealt with in some appropriate way. And that would not have happened without the level of engagement Russia showed with this campaign.
But from what we gather from our intelligence people and other people that are watching this, Russia continues to interfere in our process, election process. They're not going to give up through one election cycle.
Yeah.
So question is, how do we counter this? How do we not just for ourselves but for the Europeans?
Yes, you know, it's a very big issue. I think part of it is smarter consumers. So one of the things we did not understand in 2016 here was that you had insulated groups. So groups of voters who were looking only at selected media opportunities, and that it was very easy for $100,000 in Russian Facebook ads to reach those groups and influence them. So now the architecture of these social media platforms needs to change a bit to try to at least make it apparent when that is happening, but also to let the people reading it understand better that they're seeing something that is not promoted by people who actually share their views. It's promoted by people who have an interest in manipulating them. And I think one of the encouraging things is the failure of the Russian intrusions in France and Germany, because they certainly tried the same game plans in France and then in Germany again. Now, the AfD seems to have benefited in Germany.
In East Germany.
In East Germany. But East Germany is a tough nut, right? It's
I think 40% voted for either the Links or the...
yeah, I mean, East Germany has always seems to have been the source of extremism in German politics, and so I think that's a larger historical issue. But so I think on the issue of how do we deal with Russian interference, it's one, making people smarter, two, making sure the opposing voices are better. I mean, one of the things, I spent time this spring just talking to people who were involved in last year's campaigns, especially on the social media side, and it was apparent, the Trump campaign was making massive buys in social media in the run-up to the immediate weeks before the election. They would have individualized messages. One person said they had something like 155,000 individualized messages on one day, a week or so before the election. The Clinton campaign had 3. And so it just wasn't playing as well. And then we have to make sure that our infrastructure can withstand attacks, the counting of votes and other things, and that's underway, I think.
Right. Plus, of course, Russia will not give up. The question is also on the other side, how do we affect Russian policy? Should we be involved in the Russian elections? They have elections coming up next year, remember?
Well, I think one of the things, and should we be involved? No, I mean, I think we should support Democrats and help them in whatever way we can. Russia's made that very difficult to do in an open way, right, with these laws and the arrests of activists and other things.
But through the social media, I'm saying, in a way that they in a way interfered in our elections, can we promote democracy through the social media in their elections?
I guess I'd say it's probably not ours to promote, and I'm speaking a little bit as the government official I once was, but I think there are 2 points. One is, ahead of their presidential elections, the Russians are trying to restrict space on social media. So they've put in place new requirements for social media firms to register, supposedly to provide data. So far, none of the Western social media firms have agreed to provide any of this personal data. But you see on Russia-only platforms, there was now I forgot the name, but there was a Russian instant messaging service that was used to...
Contact?
No, it wasn't. Contact is the kind of Facebook equivalent.
Facebook.
But there was an instant messaging platform that was used by the truckers to organize their strike. And you've seen that essentially shut down. And if Contact is in a lot of, we'll say, consultations with the government on what it's going to do. So it's difficult to have a digital space that's free in Russia because they're headed toward, I guess it's 70 and 70 is what they want for President Putin, right? 70% turnout, 70% of the vote. What is remarkable to me, though, are the popular demonstrations that are arising across Russia, and I don't think there's any Western involvement. This isn't a backed campaign or anything. Certainly not Secretary Clinton giving people the word, as was said 6 years ago. It's a homegrown sense of staleness in the society, and you're seeing people say, it's not enough that now we get to go on vacation overseas or something. Our own society is now being run for a bunch of old men, and we don't want that, and that's a remarkable thing to watch. Whether it can have any influence for next year, I don't know, but it's a tremendous thing for anyone to see.
We could have a replay of the stagnation years, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It does seem like a pattern is repeating itself at the top, and that's. I don't know that it will get that far because the system isn't as closed as it was, but I do think Russia has some structural issues that it will have to address.
Back to the Balkans.
Yeah.
Montenegro joined NATO. Who's next? How do you see NATO's evolution in the region?
Yeah, I don't know how they'll. I guess for me, it's the NATO and the EU together, right? That we're talking about a space of Europe whole and free,
right,
where the citizens of each country can choose the alliances they want to be part of. And so I'm not sure who's next in which order. The EU will take longer because it always takes longer, and it has particular challenges right now. I thought Montenegro getting into NATO was a tremendous achievement, and congratulations to everyone who's worked for that. I think of it for a few reasons. One is it was a strong signal about this administration's willingness to carry on the policies of previous administrations. You know, there were rumors that President Trump had questions, wasn't interested, thought it might be a way of negotiating with other NATO members, something. But instead, you know, everyone realized this was the right thing to do. The second thing is it's a strong statement about the reach of freedom in Europe, because you do want to see NATO reach down into the Adriatic and further down. Montenegro has a legacy as a really important, you know, place of naval operations, and I think for it to be firmly locked in a Western trajectory is a really important step. So who's next? I think people ultimately at some stage want to know which way Serbia is going to want to go. I think it's important. I think, you know, there have been these great histories recently written about the last years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Cold War, as people digging through the Soviet archives. If you look at all of them, what you see is a tradition of, from within, say, the Warsaw Pact, the Hungarians playing a very difficult role, always being the one to stand up against whatever centralized power there was. Same thing with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Obviously, Yugoslavia, led by a kind of Serb elite, had played the same role in the socialist East. And so I think there's a historical way in which those countries have traditionally tried to straddle East and West, or to have relationships that look East and look West. I think we have to accept that that is the culture and the history of those places, but I think people there have to be aware of two things. One is that we'll say the pro-Eastern side is often heavily manipulated, that this is being done on behalf of a particular state with its particular interests, and so you need to be careful. And the second is you can lean a little further east, but it's harder to come back. You know, I think the West is a much more permeable environment, and that's one that's really important. But sorry, I've taken us off a little bit. Just what NATO's going to want to do. But
it's interesting what you're saying. Cause my thoughts, my follow-up question was the Serbian-Russian relationship.
Yeah.
How it affects Serbia's potential, let's say, accession to NATO in the future.
Right.
One would think if one was a soldier in Serbia, one would want to be part of the most modern, updated, effective militaries in the world, not a Russian system which, you know, despite all the exercises, if you look underneath, it's actually not performing that well.
Right.
And it's very, let's say, starved of funding and financing. So will Serbia eventually realize that its future belongs in Western alliance, not some sort of no man's land?
You know, I don't know. And I, you know, I haven't been in Serbia for a number of years. When you asked me to do this, my protest was I feel a little like Rip Van Winkle, right? And I last worked professionally full-time on the Balkans 17 years ago. And, you know, at that time, the HDZ was important in Croatia. Ramush Haradinaj was a leading political figure in Kosovo. And yeah, so you know, Milo Đukanović and his team were still responsible in Montenegro. So I feel like everything's changed. But I think for Serbia, I don't quite know. I think it's clear the attraction of involvement with the EU is overwhelming, and there's nothing that Russia can provide that's anywhere close to that. I think the military question is a bit harder for Serbia You know, they still have, I guess, the MOD building remains in tatters. You know, and so that's a bit harder one. We may have to find a clever way for Serbia to be more and more engaged with NATO before it has to face the political decision of which way it's going to go. And I think for Serbia this will lead on a bit longer before it makes its choice.
Let's go on to the EU. You mentioned the EU. Do you think the European Union, of course, has its own internal problems, and some would say existential problems, but is it doing enough to democratize, reform, integrate the West Balkan states?
No, I think it clearly could do more. I mean, look, since the EU, we're just now starting to come out of the 2008 financial crisis, and so those, in a way, that put many of these political questions just on a back burner. Many EU countries are dealing with their own question of cultural identity, and the fear that brings about involving states that have historically been kind of on the other side of the wall from Europe means it's a sensitive issue. But I think there's much more that can be done to integrate, at least economically, and to help the political systems be more compatible. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is in all the states that are still emerging from socialism, but especially those that weren't admitted in 2004, say, there's still too close a connection of economic activity and political power. Generally when someone gets into government, they control not only public patronage and the television advertising and all the things that go with that, but then there's this vast amount of wealth from state-owned enterprises, so their board seats, their revenue flows off of the telecoms companies, the water utilities, all these. And so politics becomes really about dividing up those resources rather than about the kinds of things the West often talks about when we talk about politics. And I feel like that's an area where, without having to approach the question of membership, the EU could do much more to separate out that control. I believe what that would do is change considerably the domestic politics of virtually all these countries. Kosovo is actually a little bit different, right, because its public sector had been so abused by Serbia for so long. In a way, there are fewer riches there for politicians to fight over. But you look at a place like Bosnia, the traditional sources of cash in the economy remain the things that politicians try to control. So you see Milorad Dodik, he arose as a reformer, but then he saw there was a power vacuum. He moved into that and essentially took over all these state entities, some state property, and now he's selling that. That's how he lives. It's awful. And I'm surprised the EU hasn't sanctioned him more. Like that's the kind of thing, because you want to get at the way in which the political leaders have control over these resources. And so I'd see the EU going at that as part of a discussion about membership. But clearly they could do more. But that's where I would put the emphasis right now.
So some voices in the EU are talking about linkage. In other words, that we will take in several countries when they all qualify.
Yeah.
It could be acquis communautaire, close the chapters and so forth, which puts Montenegro in a difficult position vis-a-vis Serbia.
Yeah.
The link between Montenegro and Serbia going in together into the EU. In other words, the slower country, which is clearly Serbia, can slow down a country which seems to be trying to surge ahead. So how do you see that?
Well, kind of two reactions. I mean, one is the traditional approach for both NATO and the EU has been that when a country's ready, a country's ready. Right. Now, obviously, the EU has tended to take in countries in groups. I mean, the big boom of 2004, even 2007 was 2. And since then we've had Slovenia and Croatia, but I think it would make sense to tell each country that you're being evaluated on your own, and to try to create a bit of healthy competition between countries toward real reform. I also think there's a problem I have with statecraft here, in that I think that's discussion the U.S. and the EU ought to have regularly, because we have different relationships with the countries. But if we could agree on the approach, we can then use those different relationships more effectively. And it feels to me sometimes as though there isn't a real strategic discussion. Yeah. You know, and that gets back to where we started. I think, so Hoyt Yi, who's the American diplomat who handles these things every day, he's really talented. He's got, I worked with him in '94 on the first peace agreement in Bosnia. So he's got a depth of relationships there. But he can't have that discussion with the chancellor, you know, with the high representative. You know, he needs the vice president. He needs somebody else to get actually engaged in this discussion. And I think if I had one message for the leaders from the region, it would be to make sure that in all their interactions with the White House and OVP, that they're asking for direct engagement on some of these questions. You know, what is it the EU approach? You know, can occasionally Vice President Pence pick up the phone and call a leader when there's a constitutional crisis and be much more engaged?
Which takes us to the sort of transatlantic relationship writ large. How do you see US-European relations develop? I mean, during the election campaign, Trump did espouse this protectionist, anti-free trade agenda, but you know, we are so heavily involved with Europe in trade, investment, labor, and everything else. So how, you know, surely those bonds aren't going to be broken regardless of Brexit. How do you see this developing?
Yeah.
Will there be a free trade agreement? Let's put it that way.
I think we will not see any bold move toward greater integration. It just seems to me it's past the political ability of either side. But I don't see a push for disintegration, at least not in this administration. You know, I think what we're seeing, whether it's in Catalonia, Scotland, you know, the UK and Brexit, we are seeing this push in Europe for talk about, again, a national identity, whether it's at the level of a current member state or below that. And certainly there's a strand in the U.S., this isolationist strand, that also says we should be ourselves alone. And others, it's good if others are able to break off as well. But that's not dominant at the moment. It's just louder than it used to be. And I think one of the open questions of the next decade is whether that strain kind of goes back in its closet, or whether it becomes the dominant strain, as it did in the 1920s and 1930s. And that's a political challenge for each of us in our home countries, to have the discussion about the direction our countries are going to go.
But that strain in the 20s and 30s, remember, led to, it was an expansionist nationalism, particularly in the side of Germany and Italy. It wasn't an isolationist nationalism.
Right, and that's what led to many of the tensions. But I think the space for some of those ideas to get traction was created because you saw a lot of disinterest in whatever preventive diplomacy or others. I mean, this is I said there's a great point on either side, but yeah.
You mentioned, Jim, Catalonia, which had its legal referendum, and the Serb government, or members of the Serb government, jumped on this, saying that Europe is being hypocritical in not recognizing Catalonia's vote for independence while recognizing Kosovo.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, can you sort of spell out the differences between the two situations?
Well, I don't want to be one of these instant experts on Catalonia, right? I mean, it does seem to me that Catalonia has done very well as a result of Spain's accession to the European Union. I mean, it's had enormous growth in income, GDP. It has substantial autonomy, and it doesn't face the kinds of oppression that fueled Kosovo's need for independence.
Sure.
You know, the back to what we saw in the 90s. I mean, the initial proposals, when I first became involved, we were just looking for Kosovo to have greater autonomy, the ability to educate its people in public institutions, control the local resources in the way that other parts of what had been Yugoslavia were able to. And it became clear that, at least for the Serbian leadership of the time, that held no interest, that they wanted, other than the ability to falsely claim Kosovar votes for their selected, national candidates, they had no interest in Kosovo other than as a sort of historical monument and as a place to oppress the vast majority of the population. That's a situation that, in my mind, was unique in Europe at the time, and whatever desire for self-expression and determination there are in other places around Europe, it's very hard to find anything that looks like Kosovo did at the time, where essentially Belgrade said, we don't want to govern this in a responsible way. And I think that left us with, again, our policy was at the time, once we intervened after this humanitarian catastrophe began, our policy was, let's take a few years, calm everything down, and then begin talks toward a new relationship. And that's what ultimately led to the Declaration of Independence.
Sure.
And that was a different administration from the one I served, right? That was across the U.S. political spectrum, saying this is really the only way to handle this situation.
Should we be focused on these, the 5 holdouts in the European Union that don't recognize Kosovo? Because Kosovo presumably one day should also be a member of the European Union, but it cannot if 5 countries do not recognize its existence.
Yeah. I do think so. I think it should be a constant topic of discussion in the U.S. and those countries' bilateral relations. They each have their own separate domestic issues, around this. Although it's harder and harder for I think a couple of them to see the position as anything more than habit at this time. So I would keep pressing on it.
Jim, final question, because I see we're coming to the end of our time. How is Secretary Albright these days? What is she doing? Has she visited the region, Balkans recently? Is she planning to? As you know, she's very highly remembered, fondly remembered in Pristina in particular, for her important role in bringing, let's say, liberation to Kosovo. Yeah. So how is she now?
She's amazing. I mean, I went to work with her in 1994, and I thought that would last a year. And to both of our surprise, I've never left, because I just find her remarkable, and she remains so. I think her health is great. She's deeply involved, especially in transatlantic issues, and I see her as one of the strongest voices in the U.S. for a recommitment to transatlantic relations, and so I think she'll be very active on that front. We've talked about, she wants to get back. I think 2-3 years since she's been in Kosovo. She was in Bosnia 2 years ago, I think. So we'll look for some suitable opportunity. She always says it's the thing she's most proud of as secretary. It was she herself was forced to flee during World War II and then forced to flee socialism. And she saw the people of Kosovo as people being forced to flee from violence and oppression, and she felt it was the best tradition of America to stand up and say no more. And she's very proud of the role she played in that.
Thanks, Jim, on that note, and thank you for all the stellar work that you've done in the region as well. I think it's very much appreciated throughout the region.
No, thanks for having me, Janis. I look forward to talking about this more.
Okay.
Thanks for all your work.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Jim. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and here at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshin.